June asked me to come and introduce Ali and Hamid, which is a great pleasure for me because they're friends. So we're very lucky to have civil architecture here today. Civil architecture is a cultural practice preoccupied with the making of buildings and books about them. The work of civil asks what it means to produce architecture in a decidedly uncivil time, presenting a new civic character for a global condition. Since its founding by Hamid Boukhmesine and Ali Kariemi, the practice has attracted a strong following for their provocative works and their offer of an alternate future for a nascent Middle East. So please join me in welcoming civil architecture.
We just want to start off by saying that apologies to everybody who would come, assuming that this lecture is going to be loud. So just a heads up, the entirety of the lecture is going to be in English. We'd like to first off thank Dr. Benoon specifically but not limited to Rana Beyrouti, of course, Ahmed Amin, who would invite us over to come over here. It's our second time in Amman, and it's always a great pleasure to be here. And on that note, we are civil architecture, as Rana mentioned, Ali Kariemi and Hamid Boukhmesine, the principles of the practice. Our practice is based between Bahrain and Kuwait. Civil leverages exhibitions, publications as ways to generate contacts for architectural projects, building a body of knowledge from which to practice and evaluate the work that we produce.
Today we'll present 3 projects. They range from a large-scale public project or a proposal for a public park, to a small house extension, and then to an installation in a biennial. These projects span the scales from, let's say, the landscape territorial to the architectural intervention. And we hope that, let's say, within this presentation, we'll explain maybe to some extent the title and why these projects fall under a larger, let's say, genre, or at least working genre for us, of the ambient work. A series of kind of works and precedents that have been the subject of our interest over the past year and a half. Works that are didactic expressions of their context, their background implements for understanding the places they're in, and for further developing one's understanding of the space they're in. So ultimately we place the works that will be presented in a category, one as a way of understanding and underscoring their ambitions, but also to draw affinities between the projects that we've designed, we've thought of, to projects we also find interesting. Projects which we'll discuss today, like العمارة, Jantar Mantar, and الإفراج في الخليج.
To begin, we start off with one of the projects that we had, not necessarily, but we had pitched and proposed a few years back, the Abu Makhrou Park. So Abu Makhrou is a park that was proposed in the Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, but prior to kind of delving deep into the design aspects and what we eventually came up with, we wanted to talk to you about the research that led to its conception and how it also ties to the thematic of today's presentation. So, within the peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, the narrative of the fossil fuel economy has overwritten previous traditions of landscape and territory. As a happy partner in the transformation, architectural and urban discourse has predominantly centered around the integration of the cities into the global economy, reproducing a generic built environment as a form of global currency. In the cases that architectural theory looks for pre-oil precedents primarily within the Gulf, which is our area of concern, research then focuses on traditional homes, mosques, and the study of the heuristic spatial practices of local tribes that resulted in the clustering of the courtyard homes that have become synonymous within the region. These cases are useful as architectural precedents, but less so for planning study of formal operations and policy. They also offer little in the way of organizing territorial relationships between the city as a place of trade and habitation and the productive rural landscapes that sustain city life. These precedents offer insights into the political dynamics of small towns, but provide few strategies, formal strategies, beyond perhaps organic alleyways, and even fewer that can be applied by a planning body. So, the investigation of incremental urban accumulation in Gulf towns as a study of planning is different from the word of planning in Arabic, which is tafleed, or line making, the drawing of lines and applying them to land. The reality of the Gulf Mat city is that its most legitimizing factor is that it was not planned, Rather, it was a product of various adjacent families living under the auspices of a tribal regime guaranteed autonomy by its inhabitants. However, when directing our attention to the landscapes of the region, we notice that the historic water channels, for example, of Arabia, constitute the region's most extensive collective infrastructure. The challenges posed by a hot and arid climate, with low rainfall and little drinkable water, necessitated a series of architectural and ecological social innovations that could sustain life within the area. These came in the form of planned systems of water conveyance from springs to farms. Millennia of reliance on these sources of water form the basis of codes to ensure equal rights among the community and equitable use of the land share resource. These springs constituted a public domain of stakeholders in the community who were responsible for maintaining and sustaining them, and sustaining their water channels. The larger springs were among the earliest public spaces in the region, and the gendered nature of their use of these springs also meant that they were assigned separate hours for men and women to use their water. It could be said that the channels of Arabia are a 2,000-year example of a non-urban past. A planned and studied, measured and all-encompassing cosmology and social order of its own. It is not the organic Arab city that provides historical case studies on how to plan land, but the gridded and studied subdivision of farmlands and the organized construction of underground channels to serve distant territories. It is the argument for both maintaining an alternative to the constructed scarcity of today's property market and the idea of growth as a constant reinforcement of this artificial scarcity, especially in the context where water and food scarcity is a very real and ever-present concern that the study of these farms is set against. So, in contrast to the laissez-faire practices of town making, these lines were drawn based off of a priori configuration tested over thousands of years with a shared set of cultural and political planning practices that govern their construction and their use. So rules of planting, hunting, water distribution, even the careful land subdivision reveal not an unplanned Gulf city, but rather a deliberate and painstaking application of planning as part of both formal and political processes. It is in this regard that the landscape of the Gulf is far more urban, far more planned than its cities, and its social structure is a lot more urban. This research became the C for a proposal that we did recently for Riyadh and the municipality for Abu Makhlouk's competition. So just to also give you with this background information, the mountain of Abu Makhlouk in Riyadh, from which we based this research, which we tapped into this research, was considered an important natural feature within the city, used for centuries as a landmark on trade routes, marking the entry and exit point of Hajar, which is Riyadh's former name. In the 1950s, with the opening of the government agencies in Riyadh as the capital of Saudi, a series of districts were planned around the old center. And Melez was one of the 5 districts built to provide housing for government employees, which also included the park surrounding Abu Makhlouk, which opened in 1979 and was closed in 2012 due to poor maintenance and neglect following from which the municipality would launch a competition for its revival. So, rather than restoring the green condition of this park, we argue that what made Abu Makhlouk rather interesting was that it was an urban mountain, a mountain that offered an idea of leisure and rest that did not require greenery, simply the quiet and beauty that the desert offers. The proposal maintains Abu Makhlouk's unique presence as a public park that is a topographic feature. The remainder of the site is turned into the contemporary imagining of a farm, retaining the subdivisions of planting that would have been present at the beginning of the 20th century, but taking on a new form. And in contrast to the European part or American countryside, the landscape of the Arabian Peninsula forms itself around textures of rocks and topography. It is a more cartographic entity, a spatial condition of nodes and markers, than it is a landscape. When it is productive, that productive landscape is what John Dixon Hunt would identify as a first, second, and third nature. One which is primal, one which is productive, and one which is formal, decorative, and aesthetic. The productive landscapes are spaces of recreation and relaxation, and the very nature of the amount of effort it takes to sustain these landscapes.
One of the things that came up while we were working initially on the study of the farms and the farmland in the Gulf was well, one, looking, okay, so what are the subdivisions? What are the names being used for these subdivisions and what are the terms being used for the water channels? So when would they say sab, when would they say menja, when would they say qana, when would they say saqir? And then beginning to understand, really on a kind of farm to farm basis, what changes were being implemented on each farm. Some which were implementing drip irrigation, some which were still using a traditional basin irrigation method. So having the water come from either a spring or a pump, and then irrigating these different shurb, each with a different product or produce. So for example, alfalfa, onions, and then also scattering palm trees in between, or mango trees, or bananas. So for us, it was an interest in saying, well, all right, if we look at it in the case of the 21st century, let's say Riyadh, but also Gulf in general, the questions of productivity in these farms are maybe better served by pink farms or offloading farming elsewhere. But if we consider them more as recreational landscapes, then which many of these farms still are, then their use is kind of semi-productive or productive, but also aesthetic property, something like what you'd have as a villa or an estate, which still has not only cultural relevance, but also allows an entry point and someone to understand fundamentally the nature of the place they're in. So for us, maybe the scheme retains to some extent some of the graded subdivisions, but using them as a way of programming a public park, which said productivity can still be maintained in a place like Riyadh, where a productive landscape is very much still an aesthetic landscape. That productivity, when left, or that landscape when left to its own devices, would eventually run fallow and then dry up and die, which is what happened to the mountain. And the mountain had these series of green terraces, and then eventually, as the management of the mountain fell apart, it reverted to a mountain. And so the argument for a public landscape being a productive park was the discussion we had wanted to bring it into, really trying to find a space out of the greenscaping that is otherwise predominant in many of the parks being implemented in Saudi Arabia. So the grass, the greenery, and also the forms of maintenance it requires. So the close crop grass, the importation of fertilizers, the various crop rotations that also had kind of fallen out of use to ensure our public park would be consistent year round. So one of the things that we had also from the farm project we were interested in was saying, okay, well, what are the cycles of planting and rotations that are also being implemented in these farms that would be interesting to bring into a public park in Saudi Arabia? Saying, well, all right, would I want to go to this park in the summer to see date season? Would I want to go see when basil, cabbage are being harvested? And for us, this also meant that the public park would naturally have a life and would naturally incorporate these forms of maintenance. We go through this because initially the park was a way of kind of thinking about a landscape and an approach to landscape, but it very much became a kind of cross of saying, all right, how do we implement some of the research on a design level, but what are the questions that come up from looking at something long enough? The farms we see throughout the year kind of driving around in the Gulf, and the questions that they produced, I think particularly had to do with the nature of day-to-day life and its habitation over a period of time. And so after Makhroob, we were working on another intervention in the landscape, however, a much smaller intervention and in a much kind of the sort of landscape that maybe I was criticizing earlier. We were asked to extend a house in a garden. That's almost the entirety of the brief. The house is an existing 1950s, one-story British-designed villa in a subdivision in Bahrain. And the configuration of spaces is as you would imagine. There's a foyer, a two-car garage, a living room, a kitchen, which is still on the inside, so it's not a kind of dirty kitchen, which you'd see in most houses now, but a kind of kitchen, or the dirty kitchen was inside the house, and then bedrooms, so master bedroom and one bedroom for children. The garden looks like this: close-crop grass and planting on the sides. And the family asked for a small pavilion extending the house. So this conversation had occurred right around the second year of the pandemic. So there was the hope of an end in sight. But the husband wanted a place where he could have guests over and not risk his son, who was about a year and a half at that time, from getting sick or bothering his wife. But also, given that they were both working from home at the time, the question was, well, can we have a space that could be a majlis, but also an office, but also, and as most conversations of again, anyone working in office, and particularly in homes, scope creep was incurred, and the project grew from a kind of outdoor office / majlis to a sort of, or an outdoor pavilion, to a majlis, then to a mini house, and then it ended up being around 100 square meter. And so really it went from being an extension in a garden, or a room in a garden, to an extension in a garden, to really a house, or a small house within a garden. And when we asked the question, and maybe it was a kind of dumb question to ask for an architect, which is, where do you see the house sitting, or this extension sitting? And I mean, we had ideas of where it could sit, but somehow the answer, and I think the answers to dumb questions are sometimes more telling than the smart answers to smart questions. It's a dumb question because it allows you an into how they imagine this thing extending their house. And they said, well, it would be nice to have it between the date palm and the knar tree. These two trees in the back. Date palm, I think you're all familiar with, and knar tree is the local name for a kind of jujubi. And that answer maybe became the entirety of the project. So, because initially we had referred to the project as the Team Garden Majlis, and then also the Mutar house.
Yeah.
And then eventually we started referring to it internally as the house that sits between the palm tree and the knar tree. And as Hamid and I would talk about, we would say, شو نحط بين الكنار والتمر. And I think maybe in the most direct way the question really became, what do we put between these two trees? And what does it mean to put something between two trees? This is an image of date drying in Fujairah. This is a palm grove in Fujairah, and it has a bunch of satellite dishes in the workers' residences, and the satellite dishes in the summer are converted to these little pans for drying dates. That's not the most efficient way of drying dates, or at least the easiest way. The dates are dried over the course of June, depending on what type of dates, June, July, or early August. Typically, they're dried on the floor, and sometimes, in some cases, for lower-lying buildings, on the floor of the let's say courtyard between the farming buildings, or one large kind of empty area to the back, or sometimes even on the roofs of some of the buildings. And so we began to think from the question of the two trees, of let's say, well, what happens between these two trees, right? So we have the date palm season. Maybe we can do it. So we kind of thought, you kind of follow the question all the way through, right? So you say, okay, and then a صيف, which there's two summers, في الصيف وفي الجيل. So thinking about it also initially even as something that happens between the palm tree's life as something that's happening between two summers. And then maybe the jujubee's life as something happening between spring and winter. So the jujubee's harvest being in February, March, to some extent April, and then the life of the palm tree being later in the summer. But that's one life. That's the life of harvest. Then there's also, let's say in the case of the jujube, there's the life of, actually I'm running ahead of myself. In the case of the jujube, there's also the life of the tree shedding. So shedding extra leaves in December, having to be cleaned constantly, however it sheds fairly regularly. And so we created a calendar for ourselves just to think of every possible thing that could occur in this garden. They don't have lime trees, they don't have figs, they don't have pomegranates, but you can almost begin to think of the life of that house in that way. And initially, maybe not any of these questions began to emerge in the design. But we were trying to think of things that might have an affinity with this project. What could we look at as a way of understanding what this building should do, and what would it mean to inhabit the house between two trees? And so, as Hamid mentioned, we've been interested in these forms of pre-modern planning in relationships to the land and the territory, and projects preceding the Majlis, kind of like the Abu Makhroob, and also the ones in Amman Design Week. We're looking at ways of understanding or linking between some of the stuff that might be happening in the territory to what a building can do. And increasingly, off of Abu Makhroob, we're looking, well, it's clear that a public park or a farm can have all these components. Well, what could a building do in relationship to these things? And so we began to be interested in the genre I mentioned, this idea of what it means to have maybe something that's more of an ambient work, a building which mediates the relationship to the outside world, but also embodies it. And maybe to some extent augments it as well. So what is a building doing in relationship to its context? And how are buildings instrumentalized, not only for making use or reacting to their context? So we say Al-Amara is a kind of desert castle, but a castle which sits on the periphery of a wadi with nearby reservoirs. But also a building which exemplifies a certain kind of urban nomadic dialectic that might have been present in Umayyad times. But fundamentally, the building itself is an instrument for understanding its context, not only through the form or the architectural instruments, but also through its interiors and its embedded narratives. And I mean, we used to not like going to touristic things because it always felt like it was a kind of packaged narrative. But I think increasingly, I think
no, it's actually that I enjoy them.
Yeah, we increasingly like touristic sites, maybe because less for what they are or for the narratives they tell, but usually the buildings selected have a certain totality. They describe a condition in its entirety. And so somehow a touristic site has to have a sense of narrative self-sufficiency that tells you everything about themselves or the period that they're in. And as such, maybe the building might not be so interesting as a building itself, but its ability to convey a narrative or a typical condition is maybe the most kind of enduring quality. And for us, Qasr Amra is kind of this interest. I mean, you could look at Qasr Amra within this network of kind of desert rest stops, hunting lodges, bathhouses, but you can also look at it as a thing unto its entirety. It's positioned within this network, built around kind of 720, 730 AD. It's a hunting lodge and a bathhouse. It's meant to be this kind of place where anybody could come visit in the springtime, when there would be more things to hunt, when the weather would be finer, when there'd be more things growing in the vicinity, as a kind of campground with its tent surrounding the house. And there's this whole historic narrative understood within both this idea of it being a palace, but not a palace to be inhabited throughout the year, almost like a country resort or a country villa. And ultimately, it's titled, thus describing it as a qasir, a sort of a smaller palace, a palace occupying one particular imaginary of someone inhabiting the desert at that time. But also part of a certain kind of inhabitation of architectural spaces. Where do you go in the winter? Where do you go in the summer? Where in Gale? And for us, maybe aside from the architecture, the use of the frescoes. So, I mean, the building itself describes a certain peripatetic inhabitation, moving between the city and the desert, between colder regions in the north and warm regions in the south, but also a way of conveying an understanding almost of the world at the time. I mean, not only to us as people looking at the building, but also to the people inhabiting them. So thinking of the Umayyads commissioning Egyptian, Greek, and Coptic artists to come in and illustrate the parts of the baths. The theory believing that both the entry hall having its own artists and then the baths having their later artists. The subject of what's drawn maybe is its own kind of conversation. There's naked women, there's depictions of hunting, depictions of kind of the qualities of finer life that would have been similar to Sassanid and Roman architecture. But for us, maybe the most interesting thing were the 32 depictions of laborers, depictions of people that would have been involved in the construction probably of Qasr Amra, carpenters, plasterers, artists, but also the depictions of the constellations, so and using the Ptolemaic Greek model for the constellation. And so you can almost imagine Qasr Amra, I mean, yes, it's a hunting lodge, yes, it's a bathhouse, yes, it's a recreational site, but it also, in some ways, is a mirror for princes, right? So the owner at the time was Emir. He hadn't been Emir al-Mu'mineen. He hadn't been ascended to the position of Khalifa. And so this building that he's inhabiting, to some extent, is also didactic, right? It frames an understanding of the world. There's the images of the 6 kings, the 4 of which we can still recognize as Negus of Aksum, of Ethiopia, Kisra of the First Sassanid Empire, empires that also had ended, let's say, with the Arab conquest, so the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire. But Roderick of the Visigoths, highlighting the conquests of Spain. And so we're really interested almost in this idea of a building that when a prince would enter, begins to tell a story of the world he's inhabiting, saying, you know what, okay, aside from this desert home, which is falling within the travel patterns of the time, it also tells you this is what the sky above you looks like at night. These are the hunting seasons by the constellations that you would see. These are the sorts of laborers and laborers that inhabit your empire. And this is also the kind of the position of cultural neighbors and empires that have been defeated. And maybe it's a stretch, but I think to us, looking at it almost as a machine, as a mirror for princes, as a narrative device for understanding the world, we can almost think of Qasr Amra also as a small model of the world, or a model of the empire, a way of understanding and making understandable the world in which it was sited. And so we thought maybe the measures not as a qasir per se. I mean, the ambitions are entirely different. The person commissioning it wasn't an emir and had no aspirations to a khilafah. But the building had to understand itself within its own context, right? It had to understand itself within its own garden and within its own intermittent use within the garden. So a building which probably wouldn't see guests in the summer where everyone's traveling, but might see themselves occupied in the winter. And so it began to see itself as the house between these two dates, saying that, well, the dates might require regular maintenance, pollination, someone to wrap the dates to keep them from birds in the summer, then to pick the dates, to dry them al-adhik, then to separate them, dry them further, or consume them. And the Knar tree with its regular maintenance, its sweeping, and its fruit which had to be ready at the end of January, March. And so immediately this began to tell a narrative of the building, but also maybe the things the building had to understand and make understandable. And so the building almost belongs to the garden, and as does the roof. You can see the plan. It's a fairly simple plan. Well, maybe you can't see the plan in the back. The building was understood almost as a pitched roof building sloping towards the side, towards the garden. But formally, the roof had to belong to the garden, while the rest of the building below it almost had to belong to itself. And we were interested in almost this discrepancy, reading the roof almost as a curving landscape or a curving form, which sits on what you would expect to be almost like a garden shed. In plan, you see the space of the majlis, the space of a dining room, and then behind a bedroom in case someone got corona or in case they had a guest, and a small bathroom. And so we began to imagine maybe 4 ways of inhabiting this roof. The surface, which with these mounds, which had to allow for Knar to fall onto, but also Knar to roll down, to accumulate, to pile up. Equally the leaves, which might sit on these mounds and become almost like this intermittent landscapes of both dunes in the dusty seasons and also mounds of leaves whenever they weren't cleaned. At the same time thinking, well, when it rained, where would the water accumulate? Where would the troughs and furrows be, and how would the water be drained? Where would dust begin to pile up as wind blew in from the north? And then leaving enough areas and dimples where also dates could be gathered and dried onto the roof as well. We wanted the house to reward you. We wanted the house to reward a certain kind of looking and to reward you for being in the garden, or to even to notice the garden. In some ways, even the most banal sense, right? Noticing when I have to go send someone to clean the Knar, when my husband has to spray the roof or wash off the leaves. And maybe in this kind of banal observation, it allowed the house to be, or the extension to be at least a way of inhabiting the garden, or at least a portion of the garden it took up. And as I said, the pitched roof was intention with what was under it, but there's also a sort of relation. So thinking about where the skylights are, so that they light the work table during the day, they light the bedrooms or the interior spaces in the evening, but at the same time also looking at it to create this sort of tension, right? Creating tension between the pitched roof and the building that sits under it. A surface that's displaced from the garden, but then also canted and in reference towards it. So the Mumar house is maybe less than a house. It's not a dar, almost like a dara. I don't know if maybe it's too referential to this context. It's a space less about as a resulting form or program, but more about thinking of it as a model, almost an Amra model, thinking about it as an instrument, not for telling the narrative of the empire, but for telling one narrative about the garden and one way of understanding these two trees and the surface they create below them. But this idea of using the roof, let's say literally the roof, or the architecture of the roof as a means of aligning to the seasons, of aligning to the sun and time of day, is not novel, it's historic, but it seemed urgent in the context of the house. It seemed urgent in the inhabitation of this garden, in the context of a house designed during the pandemic, but also as well as maybe the house with a child growing up, and so that also a house where the atomic clock and the Gregorian calendar have overtaken all ideas of time, particularly in the context of isolation.
So it was along this line of inquiry that the next project kind of emerged, and it was a project that we had recently completed for the Islamic Art Biennial that had taken place in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia at the beginning of this year. So religion is often like architecture, which is often like life, which was much more of contemporary art fair. So in opposition to the Tad'u Biennale, which follows the format of the contemporary arts biennial, the Islamic biennial is a much more nebulous entity, curatorially speaking at least. It brings together contemporary art, historic artifacts, illuminated manuscripts, relics, and a medley of programming. We found ourselves, when asked to participate, we found ourselves interested where architecture and religion overlapped in daily life. Specifically, we looked at sundials, and which were found across the courtyards of North Africa and the Levantine mosques. These timekeeping devices were used to regulate prayer times, while also serving as a public amenity, allowing visitors to mark the time of day and subdivide the daylight hours. The sundial is a public utility in the Islamic world, which can trace its origins to Roman times, but in the context of mosques, that meant that the solar day was also aligned with the Islamic lunar calendar. It's along this line of thought that our intervention could both tap into the history of the secular devices in a religious space as a way of both contextualizing the biennial timeline and to reconfigure the building in which it was sited. Or even to take it a step further and tap into the history of architecture as devices of timekeeping, such as the Ulagbek Observatory or the Jantar Mantar in Jaipur, where the installation treats architecture not quite as a machine, but as a system of measures closer to a sensor, feeling out and sometimes aligning with the clockwork of the universe. So again, with these references in mind, we were introduced to the site of the biennial, which was to take place in the Jeddah Outdoor Hajj Terminal, designed by the US firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, SOM, making it the first building that pilgrims would arrive at, and in effect serves as the world's largest ephemeral Islamic arts museum. So we decided on the instrumentalization of the SOM canopy of the terminal, and actually beginning to think about it as converting the SOM Hajj terminal into a large sundial in of itself as a course of action, by placing markers and inscriptions on the ground, tracing the movement of light that cast on the ground by the opening of the tents which have created the terminal. The building is reoriented not as a backdrop shading device, but as an active tool for understanding the passage of time. The installation was in a series of inscribed sun paths, tracing the movement of the skylight throughout the months of the biennial. Each hour was marked with a different obelisk and little plazas around each marker, which form fragments of the calendar which run throughout the duration of the biennial. The plazas are painted moments from the calendar, which show the events that occur throughout the day and when the sunlight reaches each point of reference. It is an intervention that reclaims the building, changing it from an airport terminal to a device within a larger lineage of astronomical buildings and observatories. It provides a metric by which to understand the massive scale of the canopy throughout its relation to both the sun and time. The calendar and the plazas highlight various cultural and lunar events, like Ramadan, rose planting season, the tides and moon phases, in addition to the mapping of the movement of the celestial bodies above the exact location of the installation. For a sundial in the context of any other biennial would suggest a certain retrospective disposition, interested in the material of timekeeping, interested in the material forms of timekeeping, or exploring scientific knowledge in the period modern as pre-modern devices. But observing a sundial under a kind of cosmological disposition that an Islamic biennial offers allows a sundial to operate as a register outside the strict confines of modern timekeeping. Much like the sundials of mosques, placing a sundial under the Hajj terminal canopy reconfigures both the airport and the sundial in of itself. The intervention reintroduces watching, observing, and waiting as key elements of daily life, and pauses contemporary buildings as a site for formulating connections to solar and lunar time. Sunpath 1444, or asks the viewer to take the time to note the mechanisms of the Hajj terminal building as a structure beyond its inhabitation, offering a way of using it to think about the world beyond. The waiting that follows the end of pilgrimage at the airport, or perhaps the beginning of the flight back from biennial, is incorporated into the waiting for a building to perform. To produce light where it is expected, it is perhaps a banal thing to sit and wait and observe at a biennial. The sundial is on one hand a non-event, its pure celestial mechanics, On the other hand, it is on an event every hour and every. Some attendees wait for the sunlight to hit the noon marker so they could take a photo together in the spotlight. Others would come at night, and the installation then acts not as a sundial, but as a calendar, highlighting the various lunar, tidal, and planetary events that would be occurring at that particular moment in time. And as you can see here, this was a specific moment during Ramadan when the sun would actually hit at each specific marker along the specific lines, and the painted platforms which highlight each of the stars that occupy the space above. And in addition to this installation, there were various programs that were held within the installation to commemorate particular events that were to take place throughout the duration of the biennial, such as the interactive performance that inaugurated the installation by Mohammed titled "We Dream of a Sea of Rice," which was inspired by the agricultural and rice farming practices taking place in Al-Hasad in eastern Saudi Arabia, where 35 performers presented a 20-minute piece that is charged with movement, poetry, and storytelling, emulating the actions of harvesting and accompanied with chants and prayers, reacting and reciting the times of year marked by the sundial. In another instance, to commemorate the beginning of Ramadan, an iftar and lecture performance was held by Professor Daniel Newman to discuss the seasonal flowers and medieval roses that were so prominent within the ta'if, and was held at that specific table called by Ma'adat al-Iftar. So the markers not only tell you what time of day it is, what time or what day it is, they also place the moment within a wider context, breaking the notion of atomic time. By situating the present in various calendars, each operating under various overlapping logics: solar, lunar, social, and ecological. The sun never hits the same place, the tides and moon never occur at the same time. The calendar situates the visitor in a temporal rhythm of we no longer observe. The work can be seen as rhythmic or intentive from a secular or non-religious perspective, but when framed within the context of biennial, it allows for these forms of care and ritual to resonate on an existential level rather than a purely mechanical one. They allow the space of banality to work within biennial, because it is in this context, as opposed to, say, purely contemporary art or architecture biennial, that banality is not a matter of tone or restraint within the work, but as a way of working towards an understanding of the world. The work can occur entirely without the frame of Islam or a biennial, but perhaps to do so within the ontological frameworks that an Islamic biennial might allow the work to exist within a view of the world of timekeeping is a collective practice, and where observation promises revelation. And on that note, we might leave you with a bit of the actual performance that Hamid had taken place. And we'll have it playing in the background, and that can conclude pretty much our session for today. Thank you so much.
Okay.
My question is in regards to your first example. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on food forests and some concepts regarding multi-tier vegetation, because it seems to, it's an ancient indigenous practice, but it's kind of gone away with monoculture farming, but I think for small spaces it can be really useful. So just what research have you done into that, and is that something you have thought about for that design, or does it not work for that particular space?
It's something that has definitely popped up in our kind of research, and in fact in our practice. Multi-tiered farming, I'm assuming, is also related to aquaponics farming, which in contemporary sense. However, when it came to addressing that particular site within Riyadh, there was this interest in really tapping back into its history that was present within the site. And as we were kind of just looking into that particular area of the city, we realized there were these kind of springs that were present within the site at one certain point. And in fact, there was this practice of sustenance that was available. It was pretty much a return to its original condition in an altered form, an albeit design form, which we found kind of fascinating, as opposed to kind of bringing in much more contemporary forms of agriculture, such as the multi-tiered, stacked, or in fact enclosed forms of cultivation.
To maybe also just talk about the move away from monocultures and multi-tiered planting. I mean, it is to an extent implemented in planting in the Gulf. So you do get both crop rotations for certain fields, the planting of plants to remove salinity that's left by basin irrigation. I mean, so particularly in Bahrain, the salinity of the water means that if you continue to do basin irrigation, you do have salinity increasing. And so there's both a tendency to plant salt-resistant plants and also to be either switching basins, rotating planting, and it has to, for example, because it's rice, you have to flood the basins constantly, and so salinity can increase quickly. But the types of plants are bred for a certain amount of salt tolerance, and then also the fields are rotated. There's different kinds of planting that we saw. So, for example, certain palm groves do benefit from planting the palm trees within 3-meter intervals of other plants that would be naturally enriching the soil with nitrogen and phosphates. And other places where the water was irrigated purely due to the water table and not actively irrigated, it would just be the palm trees left on their own with nothing else planted. That being, so it is something we looked at and something that would have been in our mind as we kind of there are forms of efficiencies that the system still doesn't have. I mean, there is crop rotation, but for example, some of the crops that they'd be planting, now we would, I mean, it's an open study to say that, for example, now you'd say, oh, maybe if we plant this kind of alfalfa or this kind of legume that wasn't natively found, you could probably be doing more with the soil, or you could be kind of refertilizing the soil and allowing for more rotations. But ultimately, the thing is, the form of basin irrigation is, if we look at it purely from an efficiency point of view, then yeah, it's not efficient. So there was a kind of middle ground that we sought to find between saying, all right, could this be, and also fundamentally trying to maintain a certain, I don't want to call it an aesthetic quality, but allowing it to operate as a public park. So for example, the palm groves are only palm trees. Ideally for the palm trees, it would just be dispersed with other planting. But you also wanted to have a palm grove where people could sit and have events. And so I think for us it was, this tension, or at least internally, was a productive tension, saying, well, do we switch to drip irrigation, but then you lose the joy of seeing basins fill up, but you also conserve more water? Or do you say, well, we're going to import certain things that now are like non-heirloom varieties, but interspersing with the planting because they might allow for more sustainable soil practices? It's a longer conversation, and I think the joy of the conversation is saying, well, what are forms of planting that we find organic or aesthetic or productive within limits? I mean, Riyadh ultimately desalinates all its water, so fundamentally the entire endeavor is not sustainable. So really the question about local forms of planting falls within the larger question of how do we mitigate unsustainability, but also where is sustainability as a conversation productive in terms of encouraging certain practices, and where is it unproductive and saying, you know, we understand that this is not large-scale planting, this can never be large-scale planting, but it might use less water than, for example, grass lawns, or it might encourage people to also consider other ways of planting and other ways of doing their lawns. And so the conversation was really about where do we find ourselves comfortable and what kind of cultures and non-monocultures, and where do we want to introduce monocultures that would be useful. But I think ultimately, ultimately it's a conversation that I think we still kind of consider pending and ongoing. We didn't win the competition, so we never got a chance to try it out. But if we were to redo it, I think trying planting some of the things that wouldn't be native but would allow the native plants to maybe work a little better, or would allow for different rotations, would probably be the way we'd go. Or maybe, who knows, maybe we should have had more aesthetic plants in the mix to allow it to be more appealing. So yeah.
More fountains.
Huh? More fountains. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I actually have a question about the second project, where you talked about the dates and how people used to write on the satellites, or on the floor. So in this case, the surface is reachable, and they can collect it and do the whole process of like getting it and everything. And then you said that you use the sealing to kind of do the same process. So what's the whole process of drying it and reaching it, and the whole process of how they do it? Was it considered, or in the, like if it's the roof, then how is it reachable for them?
Great question. So I mean, the back of the roof has its access. So there's a kind of a back ledge which has air conditioners which you can't see, which is spaced. Well, actually, I may just describe it. So in the section, the roof is pitched such that there's an access from the back, which also has air conditioning and services. So there is a kind of ledge that allows you to access it. Fundamentally, it's just one palm tree, and so the 5 or 6 bundles of dates, which usually they have someone kind of go up anyway. I mean, the climbing of a palm tree, you've probably seen someone climb a palm tree. You wrap a kind of band around yourself and you climb up the tree, and so it would have been easier, and the distance is about half a meter from the roof to the palm tree. So the idea was you could take the ladder up, hop onto the roof, and then go up and collect the dates. In Bahrain, at least initially, when you pull them down, you lay them to dry al-adhik, so in its bundle. So it's easier to just leave them in the bundles right next to with a tarbal or with a sufra or some sort of either a plastic covering or a front covering, just so that they don't get the roof dirty. If it was a palm grove, it probably would have had to be pitched differently and allowed it to dry longer periods, whereas because at least the date palm we were seeing, it was getting 4 or 5 for dates. We felt that the area of about 2 by 2 square meters was kind of enough. It's still relatively pitched, but the dimple allows it so that you can put the dates while they're still on their branch. Later on, I mean, you would either separate them and you put them just on the courtyard in the ground or in front if you wanted to dry them fully. But at least for that amount of dates, the roof is inclined, but as long as you have them in the bundle, they're not really going to run off and fall off, if that was the question.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I also have another question about the second project. What was the rationale behind researching Qasr Amra instead of something more domestic as an example?
Great question. It's I mean, there are other things that we looked at, right? Like the satellites is a kind of domestic case. The satellites aren't efficient, but it was just such a striking image because it wasn't about the efficiency. I mean, they had them laid out. What we were wondering initially when we visited was like, okay, well, you have them laid out on the ground in bundles depending on the different types of dates, khlas, khanesi, and so on. But why were they putting it on the satellite? And the best answer when we asked was they were just like, they dry faster. So for the guys working there, it would dry a little bit quicker and they can use it over the course of, let's say a week or 2 weeks. What other models we looked at? I mean, we were looking both at traditional drying spaces, which would be empty lots near or in a palm grove, or sometimes courtyard houses, so things that would be dried in the space of a domestic interior, including the stuff that would be pickled, dried, fermented, and then also public spaces where you would be doing it at the larger scale. So for example, where you dry shrimp, which had to be a little farther out the city, otherwise people would complain. So we were looking at places, these things where these things would be occurring within the Gulf. Qasr Amra was not only a precedent for the date project, or sorry, that house. It was also a precedent for the biennium. It was a precedent. What was interesting about it as a precedent was that it wasn't an instrument in its entirety. I mean, Jantar Mantar, the Ulugh Beg Observatory, Stonehenge, medicine wheels. I mean, they're very much instruments. They're instruments at the scale of architecture. They have architectural repercussions because they have stairs, arches, they have to span certain distances, and their sextants have to be a certain dimension and angle. So they're architectural in the sense that they are built as architecture and they have architectural form. But they don't quite have the same didactic roles that Qasr Amra did, in the sense that it literally had to explain the world to its inhabitant, in a way. It also had to kind of present a view of the world in a way. So it wasn't the only precedent, it was just one that we found compelling because it was a building that had to speak to its client, and not a building whose client understood what it had to say. The people commissioning observatories like Jantar Mantar or the Ulugh Beg Observatory were either knowledgeable about astronomy or felt the need to know about astronomy to the point that they said, I need you to build a sextant large enough that we can calculate time within a 2-second period. Qasir Amra, depending on whose takes you read, either Al-Walid was very much authoring the narrative, saying, I want this photo above the entryway of this woman that I like, that died, or I want these images, or other takes that say, well, he was probably more involved in some images and probably just sent an artist to commission others. And so somehow also as a kind of client-architect relationship, we found this maybe more useful as a narrative device, as a building which, I mean, we didn't show Qasr Amra to the client and said, this is sort of what your building is doing, but we like the idea that he'd have to go clear the Knar off eventually and have to watch this, pick up the dates. And so somehow the building would allow itself that kind of life. Again, not like Jantar Mata, but almost like Qasr Amra, where someone would be seeing it and inhabiting it.
I don't know how it would have flown if we had shown Qasr Amra to them. It's like, oh, this is a pleasure palace in the desert that we think would be relevant to you.
But they probably would have liked it. Yeah. They probably would have been like, oh, this is like my own little pleasure palace.
You're like, all right, well, what's up with the frescoes? No, we're not having that.
I think both the Qasr Amra and the biennial really try to reward watching. There's an interview with the son of the owner of the Gilardi house by Baragan. That's the one with the pool, that Gilardi.
Yeah, that's the one.
So they asked this. They interviewed the son of the original owner, who commissioned Baragan to design this house. The house you've probably seen if you're an architect. It's the house with the pool on the interior. The wall is painted blue. The skylights the interior, and then there's kind of a yellow hallway that leads up to this room. And the columns red.
The column's yellow. Oh wait, red. Yes.
And in the interview, he describes. They ask him, "Do you like the house?" I mean, it's a kind of simple question to ask the client or the son of a client who's inherited this house. And his reply was, for the first 5 or 10 years, I didn't really find it so interesting. I kind of thought, okay, it's my dad's house. He liked it. He commissioned it, and I just sort of have to live with it because it's a house. And then he said, one day I was coming home from work, and the color of the sky matched the color of the wall, and it almost looked like I was outdoors. And he's like, I thought that was quite beautiful, and I didn't know if it was on purpose or not. And then he's like, then a few months later, I noticed a different color and a different thing in the house, and then I thought, maybe it is intentional. And then I liked the house. And I remember saying like, oh, it would take someone 10 years to realize a certain kind of quality to this house. Maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration, but thinking about those time spans and how one would inhabit the house over the course of at least a year and activating it through the year, either explicitly by saying you go put your dates up and dry them, or implicitly by having things dry over the course of the year. Or leaves fall and you have to go rake them. To us, this as a question was maybe something that comes from both Qasr Amra and Baragan, but it's ways of looking and inhabiting. But Qasr Amra was maybe also, this is a long answer to the question, but the idea of a house, I mean this is common now, but the idea of a house or a villa that you'd only inhabit part of the year to us was compelling as also a narrative. It's an obvious narrative, everyone has one, not everyone. Everyone has this summer homes.
Oh yeah.
Everyone has I think that idea of reactivating that mobility and understanding that houses don't have to work all the time, to us was also kind of interesting from Qasr, right? I mean, we know everyone can or everyone wants to or says, oh, I'm going to leave the city in the summer or go here in the winter or I want to be there. But that idea of being baked into the house, I think is interesting because we almost inhabit these houses as kind of these consistent hermetic envelopes that have to perform the same throughout all times of year. And you may see these differences, someone like Glenmurcutt that incorporates sun paths for winter and summer, but almost the idea of the performing of the building through the year, in the case of Amra inhabited through the year and then left, and whoever's the maybe 10 or 20 people in charge of gardening, maintaining the garden, maintaining the house, or living their other life throughout the rest of the year. Those narratives, not only did we find interesting because they allow a window into time, but they also allow windows into how and when buildings need to be on. And also they allow they allow room for buildings to be off, for them to turn off the AC, turn off the lights, and just say the building is off right now. And that to us was kind of compelling, because it suggests a kind of a life to buildings that not only opens a way to more interesting buildings, but also a way out of the idea that buildings aren't maintained or need no maintenance. This idea that, oh, I build it and thus it's that way forever. It allows for other practices. It allows for kinds of plasterwork that can chip but be reapplied, because it encourages more sustainable materials, or it encourages a relationship with a person who's going to be maintaining it annually.
أي حد عنده أي سؤال؟
Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. One thing I was thinking about is there's a common thread between the biennial and the house, in that the roof or the enclosure acts as a tool to modulate light and shadow, or as a narrative device. So I was thinking about what your thoughts were about the role of the canopy in the park project.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. For us, the canopy was predominantly just, essentially a shading device, but also a way to rethink navigating this entire farm beyond the rigid rectilinearity that has become so predominant within farming practice. So breaking through the rigidity of rectilinear form, and then in reference to kind of how light plays into it, I'm not necessarily sure it would. Besides the kind of the idea that planting practice and plants just are reliant on sunlight for growth, that is. What would you think?
Take care.
I mean, there wasn't any particular thought when it came to lighting when it comes to it. So maybe that's a kind of disjointed thread in the projects that we presented so far.
I mean, the roof was very much, I think Hamid said, sums it up, the roof was the exception to the grid, and it was what breaks the grid, which I think created the room in Abu Makhrooq for it to be seen less as just a farm, and more of a farm-ish, or a farm with enough problematic forms that it was enough, the roof was enough of a gesture, or maybe it's too much of a gesture, but it was enough of a gesture to say, this is not a productive landscape. It is productive, but it's not a productive landscape, but it's an aesthetic landscape. And thus the canopy was meant to be this kind of way of highlighting the move away from the grid, which makes it kind of more willful.
The enhanced recreational aspect of it.
Yes. It also allowed it to link to the mountain. And we don't really talk about the intervention on the mountain, which was a path and then a series of kind of rest stops on the mountain. And so it was also a way of maintaining the visual language with the mountain. So the elements that hold up the roof, the roof plane, the circulation of the farms were also kind of inverted and used as shade, kind of ways of creating shade on the mountain, but without actually being overhead. So it's kind of creating these vertical walls that shade you from southern light.